Tonight I'd like to speak to you about the ever-changing rules that are going on in the around us today. It seems like every day the rules are changing. Some are pursuing the rules, a change. Some are wanting things changed in one direction, some in another, and there's a bit of uncertainty. But you know, there are certain rules that we live by, especially believers, and I have found that believers live by a rule that it runs in opposition to what our culture expects from us, the cultural norms. We live in what's called, by one author, the upside down kingdom, where our whole world has been inverted. Each week, I become more and more aware of how we are living inverted lives. I am seeing God's hand at work. I am seeing followers of Christ, church family members, believers who are going that extra mile, considering others above themselves. I picked up a book that I read some time ago. It's a book entitled The Upside Down Kingdom, and the foreword is written by an author. I'd like to read for you a portion of what he says. This author writes, "In spite of all the popular Christian teachings about Jesus' lordship, it's commonly understood what comes first. Our careers come first. Getting our house in the suburbs comes first. Living our upscaled lifestyle comes first. And then with whatever energy, time, resources we have left, we follow Christ." And it seems that we're not living by the defined and demonstrated rule that Jesus set forth for us. On Sunday, we looked at the life of Mary. We looked at the very early Annunciation when Mary found out that she was going to be the mother of the Messiah. And we pointed out two things in that message. First of all was the fact that she acknowledged God's hand in her work, in her life. He was at work in her life. And she was grateful to be included. She was grateful for the opportunity to be invited to be a part of what he was doing. Secondly, though, we said that her perspective changed. She went from seeing things solely about herself to having a perspective where she put others ahead of herself. She noticed that God was not only working in her life, but he was working in the lives of those who would fear him and trust him, as she wrote, from generation to generation. And so she saw what we call the big picture, and she began to live by a different rule, and her life became somewhat inverted, as we've said. I concluded that Christians, followers of Christ, we have adopted a new ethic. We try to live as we ought rather than what we want. And we're doing that. Even Paul said, you know, I find that I do the things that I would not do, and I don't do the things that I know that I should. There's a tension, there's a struggle. Not only are we struggling within ourselves, we're also struggling within the culture around us who expects us to act differently. We call that living an upside-down life. That's what the author of that book describes. Our peers seek personal gain and benefit for themselves. We, as followers of Christ, love others more than self. We believe that the meek will inherit the earth, and we believe that those who seek after God's righteousness will be blessed. The problem, however, is that we do not live within the kingdom of God, and that being exclusive from the rest of culture. The kingdom is not something that is set, a stationary set object that's outside of our culture. We see that we're having to live our inverted lives while living among those who see our behaviors being somewhat strange. So kingdom living may be difficult. That kingdom living that was, again, defined and demonstrated by Jesus. So just tonight, I'd like to take just a few moments to consider how we might find that kingdom, locate that kingdom, and live within it. We tend to think that, we define kingdom differently. Some see it as a set, stationary location, something that we go and enter into. But we'll find that really it's Christianity is social. It's interactive. It's not something that's separated. We live as sojourners, as travelers in this world. Jesus said in our text for tonight is this, Matthew 6:33, one simple verse, and you've heard it. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things we added to you. There's some important truths to be noted from just that one single verse, and I want to go over that. First of all, it's implying that the kingdom can be found. I remember years ago, I wanted to take Silas, who was very young, to the new radio station tower that had been built in Wake Forest for the classical radio station. And so we take off to Wake Forest, we get close. Now this was before we had GPS systems, and I simply used my cell phone to call the station and ask them where they were located. Silas and I have often laughed about it because the answer I got, I said, hey, can you tell me where I can find you guys? And he said, oh, it's very easy, sir. He said, we're down at the lower end of the dial at 89.7. And I said, no. What's your physical location? You see, we didn't even define location the same. So how can we identify a place or something that we're pursuing, we're trying to find? So here's what I want to say. Believers, we differ in our understanding of God's kingdom. And it is not just a set location. As it applies to us, we know that the kingdom exists apart from church. We've learned that in recent months. And I say months instead of weeks because it has been months. But we've learned that the kingdom of God, where he reigns, is not confined to how we practice or where we practice our faith within a physical structure. We are learning, and many have learned that God is reigning and that this relationship with him is personal. It's not something that we practice our religion, but we demonstrate our faith and our commitment and our submission when we live in obedience to God and pursue those things which are pleasing to him, when we allow him to reign in our lives by yielding to his authority. And so we have learned in these past 2 months that the kingdom is not just the church. Now I have said, and I will repeat it, I've said before that the church may find itself within the kingdom. Meaning the church may be living in submission to the lordship of Christ. But we don't always find the kingdom within the church. Because we will find that there are churches who are living outside of God's will and who are not living in submission. And it's sometimes because of the leadership, and sometimes it's because of the flock. Folks, I tell you that we will not see God's blessing upon us as a people, upon the church, until we begin to yield ourselves to him and pursue him and seek his righteousness and allow him to reign in our lives. Now, Jesus, earlier in this text, in chapter 6, has been explaining to them that they're pursuing, they're concerned with other things. I'm going to explain to you, I'll just read you the previous verses. He says, therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and is the body not more than clothing? He goes on to illustrate the birds who don't sow or reap, but yet God provides for them food. And he said, and which one of you, in being anxious about these things, can add one cubit, can add one thing to their life by worrying and fretting about it? He goes on to say later on in that text, he says, don't be anxious, saying, what shall we eat, what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? He says the Gentiles, those outside of the faith, they're the ones that are seeking these things. He says, but God knows what you need. Seek him first, and then he'll add to you those things that he knows you need. I like the way the Good News Translation reads that verse 33. The writer says this. He says, be concerned above everything else with the kingdom of God and with what he requires of you, what God requires of us, and what he will provide for you and all the other things. Focus on what he requires and what he provides and not what we're pursuing after. Eugene Peterson says in The Message this, steep your life in a God reality, a God initiative, and God provisions. Don't worry about missing out Don't worry about missing out, about lacking. And it's not lacking what you need, it's lacking what others have. Don't worry about missing out. You'll find all your everyday concerns will be met. Now the problem is we don't pursue these things. We become satisfied. We don't, as I said, He's one of the top things in our lives. He's not number one. We're pursuing our career, our retirement portfolio, we're pursuing our advancement, we're pursuing our families, what's best for our kids, we're trying to pay the bills. We're pursuing everything but God. We're not seeking Him first. We're seeking everything else. And then, as we said earlier, with what energy we have left, then we follow God. Kingdom and righteousness. These are the things that are key to our relationship with Him. Seek to find where He is reigning. Yield yourself to Him and allow yourself to be part of that reign, of that kingdom. One writer said this. He says, I don't think that pursuing other things prevent us from pursuing the kingdom. He writes, worry and carnality are the results of not seeking the kingdom first. Fretting and worrying don't prevent us. They come as a result of us not first putting God ahead of everything else. We no longer hunger and thirst for God's righteousness. We're not living inverted lives. We've accepted the norm. Because of the way things appear to be, then obviously that must be the way we should behave. We conform to what the world is doing around us. God's reign, that's what's important. We have allowed our religious practice to replace our righteousness and relationship. And I think, if anything, throughout this time we've learned not being allowed to gather together and not experiencing the worship and fellowship that we once accepted and knew. I think we've learned that to maintain this relationship and to remain within God's rule in our lives, we've got to pursue Him individually. It's got to be a pursuit, and it's got to be a priority. And I pray that it is for you. We tend to look for the wrong things to guide us. It's our tendency to miss these inner reality, this thing that we call the kingdom, because we're trapped by what we had once thought the kingdom was. The kingdom was acting out, practicing our religion, and not living by faith and pursuing Him. Jesus deserves to be first in our lives. And then following, He says, we're to love Him and then love others. And so He wants to be first, and He doesn't want to be in the top 5. And if we'll pursue Him and learn what it means to live an inverted life, putting others ahead of self, then we will begin to experience exactly what living in the kingdom really is. You think about that this week. We look forward to seeing you on Sunday.